the morning.
Hi guy, welcome back my channel. Today I will talk about Diane Jenkins. Abbott had spent too many years knowing what it felt like to be judged before she was understood, but nothing could have prepared her for the cold, suffocating terror of standing at the center of a mystery that seemed designed to destroy her. The moment she appeared at the scene, the air around her changed. What should have been a search for truth quickly became a hunt for a culprit. And because Diane was there, because her history followed her like a shadow, because too many people in Genoa City still believed she was capable of anything, suspicion found her before justice ever had the chance to breathe. At first, the horror of the crime itself swallowed every other thought. The room carried the heavy silence of something irreversible, the kind of silence that makes even the smallest movement feel dangerous. Diane could feel the weight of every stare before anyone said anything. She knew what they were seeing. They were not seeing a frightened woman trapped in the wrong place at the worst possible moment. They were seeing Diane Jenkins Abbott, a woman with a past complicated enough to make innocence look suspicious. They were seeing a wife, a mother, an Abbott by marriage, but also someone whose name had been tangled in scandal before. In that first, terrible instant, she understood that facts would matter less than perception, and perception had already turned against her. Patty Williams made sure of it. Patty's accusation landed like a match, dropped into gasoline. Her instability should have made people cautious, should have made them question whether fear, obsession, or old wounds were driving her words. Instead, her certainty infected the room. Diane saw how quickly doubt spread from one face to another, how quickly shock became calculation, how quickly everyone began silently arranging the pieces in their own minds. Patty did not need to prove anything in that moment. She only needed to point suspicion in Diane's direction, and the rest of Genoa City's memory did the work for her. That was the cruelty of it. Diane's innocence did not feel like protection. It felt useless. She could know, deep in her bones, that she had not committed the crime, but the truth was suddenly trapped inside her, unable to reach the people who needed to believe it. Every frightened breath she took looked like guilt. Every stumble over an explanation looked like evasion. Every tear looked like performance. She had walked into a nightmare where sincerity had no value because Patty had already written the first version of the story, and the first version was the one everyone wanted to believe. Detective Burrow entered the case with the hard, measured focus of someone who did not care about family loyalty, social reputation, or emotional pleas. That should have been a relief. Diane wanted an investigation. She wanted evidence examined, motives tested, inconsistencies exposed. She believed that if someone looked carefully enough, the lie would collapse. But as Burrow began to piece together what had been left behind, Diane felt that fragile hope begin to crack. The circumstantial evidence did not clear her. It closed around her. Nothing about it was direct enough to be undeniable, but that made it worse. A direct accusation could be challenged. A staged confession could be exposed. But a chain of indirect clues, each one small enough to seem reasonable, and each one placed carefully enough to support the next, created a prison without walls. The timing looked wrong for Diane. Her presence looked wrong. The emotional chaos surrounding the Abbott family looked wrong. Objects, statements, and fragments of behavior all seemed to bend toward the same conclusion, as if an invisible hand had arranged them to make Diane appear not merely suspicious, but inevitable. Burrow did not accuse her outright at first, and that restraint frightened Diane more than anger would have. He watched. He listened. He returned to the same questions from different angles, studying her reaction each time. He did not need to raise his voice. His doubt was quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. Diane could feel him building a version of her inside his mind, one shaped not by who she was now, but by who others claimed she had always been. To him, she was not yet guilty, but she was becoming possible. And once a detective begins to believe that a suspect is possible, every detail starts to glow with meaning. Jack saw the danger before many others did. His instinct was to protect Diane, not because he was blind to the evidence, but because he knew how easily evidence could be arranged when a person became the target of someone else's obsession. Jack had loved Diane through damage, through doubt, through choices that had forced them both to rebuild trust, one painful step at a time. He knew her flaws. He knew the parts of her that could be defensive, proud, desperate, and afraid. But he also knew the difference between a woman fighting for her place in a family and a woman capable of murder. That difference mattered to him, even when the rest of the room seemed ready to forget it. Kyle's defense of Diane came from a different wound. For him, this was not only about proving his mother innocent. It was about the terrible fear of losing her all over again. This time, not to disappearance or old mistakes, but to a story so powerful it could erase the mother he had finally allowed himself to love. Kyle had spent years carrying complicated feelings about Diane. Trust had never been simple between them. Forgiveness had never been clean. Yet, in the face of this accusation, all that complexity sharpened into one instinct. He could not let her be swallowed by a lie. Together, Jack and Kyle tried to hold the Abbott family steady, but the house that had always presented itself as a fortress began to feel like a battlefield. Diane could sense the fracture widening around her. Every conversation stopped when she entered. Every silence seemed loaded. Some members of the family avoided her eyes, not because they had decided she was guilty, but because they were afraid of what believing in her might cost them. Others seemed wounded by the possibility that she had brought disaster to their door, as if the accusation itself was enough to reopen every old argument about whether Diane truly belonged among them. That was the deepest cut. Diane had fought so hard to become more than her worst history. She had endured suspicion, contempt, and the quiet humiliation of knowing that some people would always view her place in the Abbott family as conditional. She had tried to prove herself not through grand declarations, but through endurance. Through staying. Through loving Jack. Through rebuilding with Kyle. Through absorbing the doubts of people who had never forgiven her and still choosing not to run. Yet now, in one violent turn, all that work seemed to vanish. The past did not simply return, it was weaponized. Patty understood that better than anyone. Her power did not come from being believed completely. It came from knowing exactly how to exploit the cracks that already existed. She knew Diane had enemies. She knew Diane's history could be twisted into motive. She knew the Abbott family had spent years carrying unresolved feelings beneath polished surfaces. Patty did not need to create doubt from nothing. She only had to feed the doubt that had always been waiting. And so Patty moved carefully from the edges of the chaos. She allowed her instability to become a shield, something people dismissed when it was convenient and underestimated when it was dangerous. She appeared fragile when fragility helped her. She appeared terrified when terror made her accusation more convincing. She let others believe she was reacting emotionally when in truth every reaction served a purpose. Behind the scenes, she tightened the trap around Diane with the patience of someone who understood that the strongest frame-up is not built from one lie, but from many half-truths placed where people are already prepared to find them. Diane felt that trap closing, but proving it was nearly impossible. Every time she tried to explain that Patty was manipulating the situation, it sounded like desperation. Every time she insisted that the evidence had been staged, it sounded like denial. Every time she pointed to inconsistencies, Burroughs seemed to hear only the frantic calculations of a woman trying to escape responsibility. The more Diane fought, the more suspicious she appeared. The calmer she tried to be, the more people wondered why she was not falling apart. There was no correct way to be innocent under that kind of scrutiny. The public pressure made everything worse. Genoa City did not need facts to form an opinion. It needed a name, a scandal, and a familiar face to attach them to. Diane's name carried enough history to make the story spread quickly. People who had not been in the room spoke as if they understood exactly what had happened. Old betrayals were dragged back into the light. Past mistakes were retold as patterns. Every rumor became another stone placed on Diane's chest until breathing itself felt like an act of resistance. Inside the Abbott home, the emotional air grew almost unbearable. Jack's loyalty to Diane began to isolate him from those who feared he was protecting her at the expense of the truth. Kyle's insistence on her innocence made him seem emotional, compromised, too close to see clearly. Diane hated that her presence was doing this to them. She hated watching Jack stand between her and suspicion, knowing each defense made him a target for criticism. She hated watching Kyle harden himself against doubt, knowing his faith in her might reopen every wound if the world convinced him he was wrong. That guilt almost broke her. Not guilt for the crime, but guilt for the damage caused by being accused of it. Diane knew she had not taken a life, but she could not deny that her past made the accusation believable to people who mattered. She could not deny that Jack and Kyle were paying for every old Diane Jenkins story ever told. In private moments, she found herself wondering whether love was enough to survive suspicion. She wondered whether being innocent mattered if everyone around her became exhausted from defending her. Burrow pressed harder as the case intensified. His questions were not cruel, but they were relentless. He wanted chronology. He wanted emotional state. He wanted reasons for Diane's presence, explanations for her reactions, clarity where chaos had left only fragments. Diane gave him everything she could, yet each answer seemed to lead him back to the same place. She could see the professional discipline in him fighting against easy conclusions, but she could also see the case taking shape. Investigators do not always need hatred to destroy someone. Sometimes they only need a pattern, and the pattern Patty had created kept pointing toward Diane. The cruelest part was that Diane understood why Burrow suspected her. That understanding did not make his suspicion fair, but it made it harder to dismiss. From a distance, through the lens of incomplete evidence, she looked like a woman with proximity, emotion, and history. Patty looked like a damaged witness with a powerful accusation. The Abbott family looked divided. The scene looked staged, but staged in a way that could still implicate Diane if someone believed she had panicked. Burrow was not chasing fantasy. He was following a trail that had been built for him. That realization forced Diane into a terrible position. She could not simply wait for the truth to emerge, because the truth was being buried faster than she could reach it. She could not rely entirely on Jack and Kyle, because their love made them easy to dismiss as biased. She could not appeal to family unity, because the family was already splintering. If Diane wanted to survive, she had to become her own advocate, her own investigator, her own shield. She had to prove not only that she was innocent, but that someone else had engineered her guilt. Yet every attempt to do that seemed to turn against her. When she questioned Patty's behavior, it looked like intimidation. When she revisited the timeline, it looked like rehearsing a defense. When she pushed back against Burrow's assumptions, it looked like arrogance. Diane had spent much of her life trying to control the way others saw her, and now she was trapped in a situation where every effort at control confirmed the worst things people already believed. The harder she tried to step out of the frame, the more tightly the frame held her. Patty watched the effect with a satisfaction that did not always show on her face. She did not need to be present in every room to dominate the story. Her accusation echoed without her. Her manipulation continued even when others repeated her version in softer, more reasonable language. That was how dangerous she had become. Patty did not merely accuse Diane once and disappear. She planted a narrative, then let fear water it. She understood that once people begin to wonder whether someone is capable of murder, it becomes almost impossible for them to stop wondering. For Diane, the emotional war became as exhausting as the legal one. She had to wake each day knowing she was being measured. She had to stand in the Abbott home and feel like a guest again, like a woman whose place could be revoked by a whisper. She had to look at Jack and wonder how much longer he could keep defending her before the pressure crushed him. She had to look at Kyle and fear that one more planted clue, one more manipulated statement, one more carefully timed revelation could make even her son hesitate. That fear was the one Patty wanted most. The frame-up was not just about the crime. It was about isolation. If Diane became separated from Jack and Kyle emotionally, then the accusation would not only threaten her freedom, it would destroy the life she had built. Patty's true cruelty lay in understanding that Diane's deepest terror was not prison, scandal, or public shame. It was abandonment. It was watching the people she loved decide that believing in her was too painful, too risky, too costly. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.